You know the bombshell Mr. Trump has thrown to the world. Here is a recap before diving deeper into responses country by country. Investors shock at the size of the levy sent markets in Asia sharply lower. Experts warned that the global economy could be upended. The world's biggest economies reacted swiftly on Thursday to President Trump's latest round of tariffs, warning of retaliation against what they described as a counterproductive move. Markets in Asia and Europe dropped sharply in response to the tariffs, and US futures were down. China vowed to take countermeasures to safeguard its own rights and interests. Its state media described the tariffs as self-defeating bullying. In Brussels, the European Commission president said in an early morning news conference that the bloc would be united in its response to the tariffs. "If you take on one of us, you take on all of us," she said. The duties posed a particular threat to attempts to revive the largest economy in Europe, Germany's economy, which has been stagnant for years. The response from Japan, the largest overseas investor in the United States, was more restrained. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba called the tariffs extremely regrettable. But he refrained from talk of retaliation, saying that his government was trying to impress upon the Trump administration that Japan is helping the United States to industrialize again. Britain also did not suggest it would immediately retaliate. Instead, Prime Minister Keir Starmer said negotiations toward a trade deal with the US would continue. Mr. Trump's move, a significant escalation, is likely to drive up prices for American consumers and manufacturers. While he had said for weeks that he would impose reciprocal tariffs, the specifics went far beyond what many experts had expected. Business groups, trade experts, economists, Democratic lawmakers and even a few Republicans swiftly denounced the tariffs, while some industries scrambled to understand how they would be affected. Mr. Trump framed his policies as a response to a national emergency, saying that tariffs were needed to boost domestic production. Others in the United States were less enthusiastic about what lay ahead. Mr. Trump could have tried to fix the rules governing global trade, which he says allies have abused to the detriment of the US economy and American consumers, said Aswar Prasad, a professor of trade policy at Cornell University. Instead, he said, Trump has chosen to blow up the system governing international trade. Here's what else to know in at a glance. Steep rates. The United States will subject Chinese goods to a staggering new tariff of 34%, on top of the tariffs that Mr. Trump had already imposed since January. The European Union's tariff was set at 20%, Japan's at 24%, Britain's at 10% and India's at 26%. Mr. Trump said little about the methodology behind those calculations. Markets fall. The initial market reaction suggested that the scale of the tariffs had come as a surprise. Futures on the S&P 500 slumped over 3%, as benchmark indexes dropped more than 3% in Japan and nearly 2% in Hong Kong and South Korea. The Stoxx Europe 600 was down 1.2% in morning trading. China's response. The country's Commerce Ministry said the new US tariffs were based on subjective and unilateral assessments, and described them as unilateral bullying. The tariffs have likely dimmed hope of a meeting between the country's top leader, Xi Jinping, and Mr. Trump, who has expressed interest in a summit. Loophole closed. Mr. Trump also scrapped a loophole called the de minimis rule, which has been used by many e-commerce companies to send low-cost goods to the United States from China without having to pay taxes. Auto tariffs. New tariffs on all automobiles made outside the United States took effect, adding to previous tariffs on steel, aluminum and other imports that Mr. Trump has imposed since returning to office in January. Prime Minister of Spain has challenged the Trump administration's argument that the latest tariffs are reciprocal, questioning the figures the United States has cited on trade with the European Union. During a televised statement, he called the Trump administration's move an effort to collect money to try to mitigate the deficit caused by a questionable fiscal policy. He asked Trump to reconsider and to negotiate a different outcome with the European Union and the rest of the world. India's Commerce Ministry said it was carefully examining the implications of the various measures announced by the United States after President Trump imposed 27% tariffs against the country. The value of India's goods exports to the US stood at over $87 billion last year, compared to its imports of about $42 billion, and President Trump has long been irritated by the US deficit in the trade of goods with India, despite enjoying a close relationship with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The Commerce Ministry said it remained focused on doubling goods and services trade between US and India to $500 billion by 2030, a goal outlined by the two governments during Modi's visit to the White House in February. With 1/5 of France's exports to the United States related to aeronautics, Airbus, the world's biggest aircraft maker, has been watching the tariff situation closely. A spokesman said the European aeronautics giant had taken note of the announcements from the Trump administration and was assessing its impact. The company may be partially shielded due to a large industrial presence in the United States, where it has an assembly plant in Alabama. But it also has manufacturing sites around Europe, as well as Canada, Mexico, and China. Germany had hoped that a new government would revive its stagnant economy, but President Trump's sweeping new tariffs are stoking worries that Europe's biggest economy will fall short of its 0.3% growth expectations this year. Germany's finance minister met with the US Treasury Secretary and US trade representatives in Washington last week, and said on Thursday that the country remained hopeful that Europe would be able to reach a deal with Washington. But he added that negotiations alone would not be enough. Denmark's industry minister said the country was ready to stand firm in response to Trump's tariffs, and that the European Union is ready with responses that are proportional but also robust. Denmark, which has been in Trump's crosshairs because of his desire to take over Greenland, has no wish to escalate trade tensions, but will work to protect its businesses and workers, Bodskov said in a statement. Laptop computers from Taiwan, wine from Italy, frozen shrimp from India, Nike sneakers from Vietnam and Irish butter. These products are found in homes across the United States, a testament to America's enduring role as a champion of free trade and its standing as the most lucrative market for goods from around the world. Trump's decision to put a 32% tariff on Switzerland stunned politicians and business leaders in the Alpine country. Switzerland has an open trade policy and recently abolished all industrial tariffs, including on goods from the United States, which is also its largest export market. Economies Suisse, Switzerland's main business lobby, denounced the tariff as unfair and said it was excessively high compared to a 20% levy on the European Union and 10% for the UK. The tax will deal a severe blow to the Swiss economy, the group said. European stock markets have followed Asian indexes lower. The Stoxx Europe 600 was down 1.2% in morning trading, with shares in most sectors, including banks, technology and consumer goods, falling. Among the hardest hit European stocks were retail brands after Trump imposed steep tariffs on major shoe and clothing producing countries, such as Vietnam and Indonesia. Shares in Adidas and Puma tumbling more than 9%. Pandora, a Danish jewelry company that makes products in Thailand, was the worst performer in the Stoxx Europe 600, plunging 13%. Although President Trump held off on imposing tariffs on oil and natural gas, prices for these commodities still fell sharply today. Brent crude, the international oil benchmark, dropped by 3% on Thursday. European natural gas futures also fell, by about 2.5%. The reaction likely reflects fears that the tariffs will apply brakes to the world economy. Demand for oil is closely related to economic growth. And Trump has focused much of his tariff fire on Asia, which has been the main growth market for oil in recent years. In a note to clients on Thursday, analysts at Citigroup said that the tariffs were much worse than expected. The chair of the European Union Parliament's International Trade Committee called President Trump's tariff announcement a mess and unfair to EU and American producers. Trump called it Liberation Day, but the chair called it Inflation Day. Britain's leader said negotiations toward a trade deal with the US would continue and did not suggest any immediate retaliation. The Trump administration imposed a 10% tariff on Britain, which the government has taken as a favorable sign, in comparison with the 20% tariff imposed on the European Union. A French leader said that the tariffs were a catastrophe for the economic world. He added that while the levies would create an immense difficulty for Europe, they would also prove catastrophic for the United States. Germany had been hoping that a new government could help revive its stagnant economy, but economists fear the tariffs could dampen the modest growth of 0.3% predicted for this year. The country's acting finance minister is calling on the European Union to react. Reports indicate that Germany remained hopeful that Europe might be able to reach a deal with Washington, but that negotiations alone would not be enough. "We do need a strong reaction," he allegedly told the BBC. "It would be naive to think that if we just sit there and let this happen, things will get better." And lastly, Japan is in a fix and here is why. After being smacked with double-digit percentage tariffs by a key ally, Japan finds itself with few retaliatory options. Since President Trump began threatening broad tariffs in January, Japan has pursued a conciliatory strategy, with Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba pledging in February to boost US investment to $1 trillion. Up until the day before Mr. Trump's tariff announcements on Wednesday, prominent business executives in Tokyo said they were hopeful Japan would be spared. Those hopes were dashed when Mr. Trump said US imports from Japan would face a 24% tariff. Last week, he said that cars, Japan's top export to the United States, would be subject to a 25% tax. While other places affected by the US tariffs, including the European Union, Canada and China, have declared their intentions to retaliate with their own taxes on American goods, Japanese officials have refrained from talking about a similar move. That is in part because the state of Japan's economy and the importance of its trade with the United States would make it difficult to do so, analysts say. Over the past few years, inflation, largely driven by rising energy and food costs, has surged in Japan and strained its economy. Japan's imports from the United States are largely commodities, including natural gas and agricultural products. That is why imposing retaliatory tariffs on US imports would be self-defeating and simply not a viable option, said a senior economist at Moody's Analytics in Tokyo. The only remaining strategy is to shift the narrative and emphasize Japan's willingness to import more commodities, he said. American officials, including Mr. Trump, have repeatedly raised concerns about Japan's non-tariff trade barriers, specifically citing import restrictions on agricultural products like rice and automotive standards that they contend put American manufacturers at a disadvantage. At a news conference on Thursday, Japan's chief cabinet secretary declined to comment on what Japan would be willing to consider conceding in trade negotiations with the United States. Other officials, including the Prime Minister, refrained from talk of retaliation. Japan's standards for certifying automobiles for use in the country are based on those established by the United Nations, the chief cabinet secretary alleged. He also said that he has explained to his counterparts in Washington the details and logic behind Japan's rice import policies. Despite this, it is extremely regrettable that the US government has announced the recent reciprocal tariff measures mentioning rice, Japan's cabinet secretary said. In any case, Japan will continue to strongly urge the United States to review its measures. Now let us review a detailed account of how countries have reacted. China. China has been hit particularly hard by the new tariffs, which take the total levy on Chinese imports to over 50%. China's Commerce Ministry called for Washington to immediately cancel the tariffs, warning they endanger global economic development and would hurt US interests and international supply chains. There is no winner in a trade war, and there is no way out for protectionism, the ministry said. Beijing has promised countermeasures. The US will impose a 34% tariff on Chinese goods, on top of the 20% that had already been imposed earlier this year. Wang Wen, Dean of Renmin University's Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, said China had become accustomed to US tariffs over the past 7 years. But these high tariffs have not reduced the US-China bilateral trade volume as well as China's trade surplus with the US. Most Chinese people believe that the US tariff war against China is ineffective. Wang speculated that potential Chinese countermeasures could include reciprocal tariffs, devaluing China's currency, and further restrictions on the export of certain rare earths to the US. Trump also closed the so-called de minimis loophole, which allowed goods worth under $800 to be imported to the US duty-free. More than 90% of all packages coming to the US enter via the de minimis regime, with about 60% of them coming from China. This exception had allowed fast fashion companies like Shein and Temu to enjoy booming business in the US. Shein is the biggest e-commerce company in the US and contributed an estimated $570 million to the US economy in 2023, according to Oxford Economics, a consultancy. But it will see its business model cratered by the closing of the loophole, which takes effect on the 2nd of May. UK. Donald Trump has hit the UK with tariffs of 10%. Downing Street, which had been expecting a 20% rate to be imposed, expressed relief to have escaped the higher rate. Keir Starmer's more conciliatory approach to the Trump administration appeared to have paid off. However, the UK's growth forecasts are likely to be downgraded as a result, and the tariffs could cost thousands of jobs and force the government to implement further spending cuts or tax rises in autumn. South Korea. South Korea's acting president, Han Duck-soo, has vowed an all-out response as Asia's fourth biggest economy reeled from Thursday's imposition of 25% tariffs on its exports to the US. Han instructed senior officials to urgently address the crisis during an emergency meeting of his Economic and Security Strategy Task Force, the Yonhap news agency reported. As the situation is very grave with the approach of the reality of a global tariff war, the government must pour out all of its capabilities at its disposal to overcome this trade crisis, Han said. The auto industry is expected to be hit particularly hard by the latest round in Trump's trade war, with leading car makers Hyundai and GM Korea expected to see a decline in US exports. South Korea exported automobiles worth $34.74 billion to the US last year, the Korea Herald said, accounting for 49% of the country's global car exports. Japan. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba said, Japan is a country that is making the largest amount of investment to the United States, so we wonder if it makes sense for Washington to apply uniform tariffs to all countries. Trade and Industry Minister Yoji Muto described the tariffs as extremely regrettable and said Tokyo was still attempting to persuade the Trump administration to think again. I have conveyed that the unilateral tariff measures taken by the United States are extremely regrettable, and I have again strongly urged Washington not to apply them to Japan, Muto told reporters. Shares in Tokyo reacted negatively, with the Nikkei stock average slumping by 4% at one point, taking the benchmark index to its lowest level for 8 months. We are expecting an extremely challenging start for Asian equity markets this morning, Tony Sycamore, market analyst at IG Australia, wrote in a note, according to Nikkei Asia. Strap in tightly folks, uncharted waters are ahead. Japanese automakers are also bracing for a slump in exports. Goldman Sachs said the levies would have a significant impact on Japanese autos and auto parts makers, as vehicles account for more than 30% of Japan's exports to the US. India. India woke up to the news of a 26% tariff on all Indian goods imported into the US. Trump had singled out India as very, very tough with their own levies, and said the 26% was a discounted reciprocal tariff for the 52% tariffs imposed by India. The Commerce Ministry was analyzing the impact of the tariffs, a senior government official said on Thursday. It is a mixed bag and not a setback for India, the commerce official told Indian media. The Indian government had worked hard in recent weeks to negotiate tariff concessions. Nearly $14 billion worth of electronics products and over $9 billion of gems and jewelry are among the top sectors to be hit by the new tariffs, as well as the textile and IT industries. However, it was good news for India that so far pharmaceuticals, one of its biggest export industries, is exempt. The US trade deficit with India currently stands at $46 billion, and Trump has made it clear that these tariffs will remain till this threat is resolved. According to reports, India is considering slashing tariffs on $23 billion worth of US imports, including gems, jewelry, pharmaceuticals, and auto parts in a bid to appease Trump and bring down the tariffs, but no trade deal has been finalized yet. Australian Prime Minister said that although no one got a better deal than Australia, the new tariff regime was a hostile act against an ally. Australia escaped comparatively lightly from the new Trump tariff regime, only incurring the blanket 10% tariff, but Albanese criticized the move. President Trump referred to reciprocal tariffs. A reciprocal tariff would be 0, not 10%, Albanese said. The administration's tariffs have no basis in logic and they go against the basis of our two nations' partnership. This is not the act of a friend. Albanese said his government would not impose retaliatory tariffs against America, currently at 0 in both directions, and said that, ultimately, the American people would bear the burden of Trump's tariffs. Some critical minerals coming out of Australia, not available in the US, will be exempt from the new tariff regime. New Zealand. Prime Minister Christopher Luxon said on Thursday New Zealand had fared better, relatively, to other countries with a 10% levy, but said tariffs and trade wars were not the way to go. There's about $900 million worth of tariff being leveled at New Zealand exporters, and that will be passed on to US consumers sadly, Luxon said. It ends up driving higher prices for US consumers, higher inflation, slows down growth, and as a result that puts real pressure in across the world. Luxon said he would be seeking discussions with US officials over their claim New Zealand was imposing a 20% tariff on US imports. "We don't understand how that figure has been calculated," he said. The US is New Zealand's fastest growing export market, becoming its second largest in 2024, ahead of Australia and after China. New Zealand exports to the US surpassed $5 billion in 2024, driven by meat, dairy and wine. The new tariff could mean a $900 million New Zealand dollar bill for New Zealand exporters. Canada. Canada has been exempted from the latest tariffs but still faces 25% levies on steel and aluminum, as well as on automobiles, which came into effect at midnight Eastern Time. Canadian Prime Minister indicated that he would fight these tariffs with countermeasures and build the strongest economy in the G7. He said that Trump had preserved a number of important elements of our relationship, but noted that the previous tariffs of 25%, which Trump said are punishment for not doing enough to stop the flow of fentanyl into the US, remained in place. The president of Canada's Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association allegedly posted on social media that the result was like dodging a bullet into the path of a tank. Mexico. Like Canada, Mexico has been exempted from the latest set of tariffs but still faces previously announced levies announced by Trump. President Claudia Sheinbaum said on Wednesday that the country would not pursue a tit-for-tat on tariffs but would rather announce a comprehensive program on Thursday. Taiwan. Taiwan's cabinet has called the tariffs very unreasonable and said it would take up the matter with the US government. The 32% tariff Trump announced against the island is expected to have a big hit on Taiwan's economy. More than 60% of its economy comes from exports, and Taiwan had a trade surplus of almost $74 billion last year. Bloomberg economists predicted a possible 3.8% contraction of its GDP due to a steep drop in exports to the US because of these tariffs. On Thursday evening, Taiwan's president, Lai Ching-te, said the tariffs did not reflect the highly complementary trade structures and substantive trade relations between Taiwan and the US. He said the trade deficit was mainly from Taiwan's industries cooperating with Trump's technology control policies during his first term. The United States' demand for Taiwan's information and communication products has become the reason for imposing high tariffs, Lei said in a statement, adding that he had urged his ministers to negotiate strongly with the US to safeguard Taiwan's interests. Taiwanese officials had been planning a response to these particular tariffs for months, including considerations of increasing its energy imports and reducing its own tariffs to balance bilateral trade, according to reports last week. The government had already scrambled to appease the Trump administration over his earlier announcement of tariffs on the semiconductor industry, of which Taiwan is the dominant player. A substantial investment by Taiwan's TSMC company in the US, announced by TSMC's chair and Trump at the White House, appeared to work, with Trump saying the deal meant TSMC would be exempt. Want to make a video like this using Pictory AI? Check out my link in the description.